So recently, Irish influencer brothers, the Happy Pear, had a podcast where they invited on a guest who claimed that antibiotics were associated with depression and, in fact, caused depression. And this has scared a lot of people, and I've got a lot of questions about it. So I'm going to very briefly break down the veracity of that today and see if it has any merit. Now, some of you might remember the Happy Pear. Last year, they made a number of alarming claims about diet and cancer, which weren't true, and I did a lot on them. I did a video here, and I gave some comments to the press on it as well. The stuff was frankly victim shaming, and it was nonsense as well. So I'm starting off with a low bar for what I assume this to be, but their guest in this case was someone that has a medical degree. Now, the caveat here is while they may have a medical degree, that doesn't mean what they're saying is true. If we click in and look at them a bit, they sell an awful lot of supplements and a lot of questionable advice here as well. So they're trying to, and they are an influencer, I mean, they've got a huge following as well. So again, they have published no research. They're just someone with a medical degree who happens to sell supplements. To me, by the way, that is a huge red flag, and that's another conversation for another day. But let's put all that aside and try to answer the question of whether antibiotics cause depressive illness. And to answer that, we have to think about two concepts. The very first one is we have to think a little bit about what that research would look like and where to find it. And the second thing we have to be aware of is a thing called spurious correlation. That two things can be associated but not cause each other, or may have a third lurking cause. For example, in summer times, drownings and ice cream sales both go up. But ice cream sales don't cause the drownings. It's the fact that the good weather encourages unsafe swimming and ice cream. And that's a good example of what's called a confounder or a lurking variable. Now, those of you who followed me for a while, I've written about these an awful lot because they do confound our statistical thinking and they make us screw things up. So we have to be careful. If we see patients who have a higher depression score and happen to be on antibiotics, that is not in itself proof positive that one causes the other. It could be the fact that if you are sick an awful lot, or maybe if you are depressed, if you are more likely to be sick. So the cause factor is really important. Scientists have an expression, by the way, about this, and it's often a little mantra we repeat, and it's correlation does not imply causation. You have to do far more advanced experiments than that. But let's look into the literature about this now. So let's just delve in for a quick search. And the most recent thing we can find to answer our questions on that is a thing called a systematic review. What a systematic review does is it takes all the reported literature on a particular topic and then tries to add all this literature together in a systematic way. So a lot of different studies, particularly on early or small studies on things, will have quite scattered results. What a systematic review is doing is trying to weigh them all up and say, what are we really seeing here? Every individual study is a data point. And as you can imagine, when it comes to diet and drug prescriptions and health, there's a whole lot of complicating factors here. So while there have been individual studies that have suggested there might be a link between depression and, say, the amount of antibiotics you're using because they might eradicate gut flora, when we put all the literature together, like this review here, it finds that the evidence is pretty weak and a lot of the experiments are not properly conducted. And one of the ways you see that, a scientist would look for hints of that, is the fact that a lot of the results are conflicting, they're contradictory. Some of them find an association with depression, some of them don't. And that happens quite a bit. When this systematic review went through it case by case, they simply found that in the few studies that they could put a quality marker on, they did not score highly in quality. This suggests that they weren't well conducted or didn't have enough patients in them or just had too many confounders that weren't properly controlled for. There was too much noise there to derive a signal. And their argument, for the most part, is that there is not enough data to make this connection. It's all conflicting and the studies that do exist are very, very weak. So, What does that tell us? Well, what that tells us is that we need to hold our horses and stop looking for simple solutions to complicated problems. Depression is a multimodal, multifactorial, complicated thing. If you go around just deciding it's all diet or it's all antibiotics, that's a really foolish thing to do. That's called a reductive cause fallacy. I wrote about them quite a bit in the Irrational Ape or Good Thinking if you're in America. But they're real mistakes that we can make. Don't take something that's really complicated and then decide there's only one reason for that. Does diet or does your gut microflora have an impact on depression? It might. It might not. I think the more pertinent question is, does it have a big impact? And these studies would suggest probably not. I mean, the effect sizes weren't used even in the most confounded ones where you should have seen the most extreme results. No. So personally, it wouldn't convince me very much. No. But I think the mistake is in looking for simple answers to complicated problems. And the other thing we have to remember is even if there was a weak associative effect between, say, short-term antibiotic usage and depressive symptoms, we use antibiotics because they save lives. They are one of the most life-saving things we have ever invented as a species, or more accurately, discovered as a species for the most part. And the fact that we're over-prescribing them is making them less effective because we're becoming more resistant to them, or the strains of illnesses we're encountering are more resistant to them. And that actually is a nascent health crisis as well that we have to be really careful of. So instead of denigrating antibiotics, we have to be more careful about their usage in general. But demonizing them is a foolish thing to do. And if they do have a small risk, which they might have, we don't know, the data is awful. Even if they do, that has to be seen in tandem with their huge beneficial effects for when you actually are sick. So, what I would say about this is what I always say: please never take your health advice from influencers or people trying to sell you things, well, products for your health, who always have the solution for the problem they're telling you about, because that's what they're doing. So, please just be cautious that the research is very scattered on this and it doesn't really have a strong message. And I would say to be wary about that and not to look for very simple solutions to complicated questions. Hope that's been helpful.